The key takeaway here is pay attention to demographics, and particularly in a state like Florida, pay attention to the generational divide. And Florida has always been known as a state that's sort of a leading indicator of where age is going to show up in other states. So there'll be a lot of states that will be looking at Florida and the generational divide. Well, everybody says that every election is historic and the most important one in their lifetime, which at the time it usually is. If there's anything to come away with this time, I believe it's the recognition that Florida already knew about, which is the diversifying of America in terms of race and ethnicity, and a real generational divide between voters under 50 and voters over 50. Republicans in Florida misread the suburban vote and misread the economy as an issue. The exit polls showed that about 62% of Floridians said that the economy was their #1 issue. And prior to the election, there was the assumption that most of those economic voters would vote for Governor Romney. But in fact, they did not. They were fairly split. And among the 4 economic issues, Governor Romney won just on the tax issue, but lost to Obama on unemployment and some other economic issues like housing and rising prices. So the economy as an issue simply did not break as heavily for the Republicans as they had anticipated. But they also lost a lot in the suburban areas. Turnout was much lower in Florida than we had anticipated, particularly in the suburban counties, where in 2010 unemployment and foreclosures were really high, and they were still higher than usual. But the bottom line was there had been enough improvement that the president's message of "we're getting better, trust me," seemed to resonate with just enough people to pull the Democrats across the line in Florida. The biggest surprise of all to everyone in Florida and nationally was the size and the cohesiveness of the youth vote. Going into the election, there had been many, many surveys, all of which suggested the enthusiasm among college students in particular was far lower than it was in 2008 when President Obama was a path-breaking candidate, breaking the race barrier. But lo and behold, not only was the youth vote larger proportionately than in 2008, just by 1%, but also as cohesive as it was in 2008. And in looking at some of the exit poll data, it was clear to me that there were around 8% of late deciders in Florida. 3% of Floridians said they made up their mind on election day who to vote for. Most of that vote, frankly, was younger voters and younger women voters. And it was clearly the case that the Obama campaign in Florida did a much better job of reaching younger voters near the end, knowing their late deciders, than the other side. Particularly campus visits of President Clinton, President Obama, and Michelle Obama were quite effective in rallying the young college student support. And among young women voters, you could see the impact of the Amendment 6 ads in key parts of the state. Younger women voters, it looks like, preliminarily broke for the president, and a lot of it was over the social issue of reproductive freedom. We'll have a good test of the longevity of this millennial vote uptick when we look at the next midterm elections, particularly in Florida. We have, of course, a governor's race coming up, and you have a lot of Senate races and governor's races in other states. So the true test of the endurance of the youth vote and its propensities politically will come, I think, during the midterm elections of 2014. It's still a very, very divided state, but the difference, of course, is the independent vote, which near the end, some of the polls were suggesting the independent vote was leaning a little bit more towards Governor Romney, but then swung back towards the president by election day. We'll continue to have almost equal proportions of older and younger, which means Republican and Democrat votes, but the fastest growing group are the independents, and they tend to be very person and issue specific in their vote choices. The Latino vote in Florida was looking very different than what it was nationally. Nationally, it was leaning about 65-35 in favor of the president, but Florida polls a week or two out showed a much closer Latino vote, and the assumption was that the Cuban vote, which is solidly Republican, or was solidly Republican, would almost be of equal size to the non-Cuban Latino vote, which of course leans a little bit more Democrat. But when all is said and done, you could really see the influence of age, because it was a generational replacement that you're seeing among Cubans in Florida. The younger Cubans are much more likely to be open to voting Democrat, which they did in 08. Let me say that again. The younger Cubans were much more open to voting for a Democrat like they did in 2012. And a lot of the pollsters missed the generational replacement that was taking place among Florida's Cuban voters. And their models of turnout were more heavily towards the old model, where there was a more solidly and cohesive Cuban vote for Republicans. It teaches us that you've got to pay attention to the changing demographics, particularly the generational replacement, since there seems to be such a stark generational divide in Florida politics. Well, of course, when you lose, you try to point to the easy things, which is demographics, but sometimes it's the candidacies themselves. There was a question going into this election of whether two white candidates on a Republican ticket would work in the very diverse states like Florida and other diverse swing states. So there was a question about candidacies, a little bit of inattention to the diversity of, key swing states. But Republicans still have some very attractive messages. They've just got to do a much better job of reaching younger voters with fiscal messages. Republicans, I think, have learned a lesson that the younger generation is much more concerned with, fiscal. The younger voters are much more interested in the Republicans' fiscal message than they are their social issue message by far. So I think you're going to see a lot less talk about some of the social issues that have really cost Republicans the election in some key congressional districts as well as key states like Florida. The big difference in polling was simply there were many, many, many more polling firms out there competing for business. Some, I'm sure, will never get another day's business after their poor prognostications, while others have fared very well. And when you really peel back some of the differences, it all goes back to the sample, who's in it. And many of these pollsters that were overly wrong were trying to define likely voters based on old models. And one of the things that Florida Democrats did, and Democrats nationally, they focused more on the sort of likely to vote voters and built them into their models, because their grassroots get out the vote using community organizers to reach voters who occasionally vote but weren't consistent voters. They got better results than those who were defining likely voters as those who vote in every election.